All right, folks. Today, we're going to deal with the third installment in a trilogy that I called Why I Had to Leave the Church. This third and last installment is my attempt at tying up all of the loose ends and bringing together all of my observations into a very concise and proper argument or set of arguments that I hope you will find convincing. I look at my deconversion or deconstruction, which preceded it, as being I've often told people that there was not a singular issue that I had to deal with. I found myself dealing with multiple issues simultaneously, but the passage within Deuteronomy 22, particularly the verse 20, or just that entire pericope, was uniquely, as I say here, is uniquely qualified to deal with this deconversion. There are unique, there's a unique utility in using the passage of Deuteronomy 22, and because of that, I consider it metonymic in a sense, just like how a metonym, like you could say, I need all hands on deck. You don't mean you need the hands of people separate from them. You mean you need them to come along, but you're referring to a part of a thing to refer to the whole. Well, similarly, Deuteronomy 22 is a part of a larger deconversion story, but it's so paradigmatic of the issues I was having with the faith that it ends up being metonymic in the sense that it can be used, and that's why I used it in this video, which could sound like clickbait or deceptive when you say why I had to leave the church and you just deal with Deuteronomy 22. Well, that's because it's metonymic. I'm using it because it so encapsulates or shows the paradigm up. Almost every significant issue I have with the text can be sort of whittled down to this passage. You can find it there. I'm getting so far ahead of myself. Obviously, we need to do our intro. I'm your friendly neighborhood apostate apostle, J-Wit. I have been sent to bring good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, to open the prison to those who are bound in religion, anti-skeptical thought, and superstition. Now, having given you guys the appropriate intro, I'm going to say that those of you who don't know who I am J-Wit. I'm called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of Ichabod. Peace to you from the pod father, Ichabod, and from them boys on the mics. All right. We're going to head right into our gratitude segment, where I highlight a comment or two from the previous week. And this one comes from the last video, which was the second installment of this trilogy. This comes from Drums of Praise. He says, man, really love the thoughts and points you make when showing the inconsistencies of this religious matrix. Definitely here for it. Thumbs up. And I have to say, thank you, Drums of Praise. That's what I'm here for myself. I'm here to, over a decade later, come back and try to rescue some people from the burning building that is religion. All right. All right. So this is going to be put on your thinking caps. I often would say on Ichabod, I would say, put on your thinking do-rags. We're getting ready to dive right into why this passage is so uniquely suited for helping. Actually, let me bring it up. So if I had to give a title for tonight's sermon, it would be The Unique deconstructive utility in the virgin proof of Deuteronomy 22. So this passage, let me say that again. The unique deconstructive utility in the virgin proof of Deuteronomy 22. All right. So let's unpack this. There is utility in using many things from the text to point out why this text is not to be trusted. Oh, lest I forget, I almost forgot to tell you guys that we've gotten to 100 followers on subscribers, I should say, on YouTube. So I think a praise belongs right there. We should be rejoicing in that, just one soul brought into this nurture plant. Let's just say all of those Ichabodians rejoice over them, right? All right. So back to what I was getting into when I say, we're going to get into the specifics of why this is the utility in using a passage like this to really be that final straw that breaks the camel's back. And I'm going to run through a couple points here, and then I'll get out of you guys here. Okay, point number one. This is about God's omniscience. If he knows all, he shouldn't be giving laws which reflect the ignorance of mankind at the time. So it's important to note, let's see here. It's important to note that although, yes, the barbarism of this practice, stoning women because of a hymen proof sheet or whatever, it's very cringy, as even the pastor, I think it's Labaudier, was pointing out. He noted how cringy it was. That really isn't enough. It's how that overlaps with the doctrine of God's omniscience, which clearly the website dealing with the National Medicine website, which starts off just assuming that it's a fact that hymen virginity tests which use the hymen and hymenoplasty, all this stuff. This stuff. Actually, let me word this correctly. That the hymen is no indicator, like a person's physiology in that region of their body is no way. There is no objective way to deduce from examining their anatomy that they are a virgin or have not had prior sexual encounters. There's no way that this is an established fact, right? So when you have that, having kind of stumbled all over that, saying that, I guess I can say that a little more efficiently. When you look at the science, which shows us that there is no way to tell by examining a woman's body whether or not she was a virgin, a so-called virgin, I should say, it reveals the lack of omniscience in Deuteronomy 22. All right. And not necessarily, it might not reveal the lack of omniscience, but at least I would say almost a criminal negligence if one does know. Because if you knew that that's not a proof of anything, but you're using, it's interesting. I didn't think about this, but we have to then account for his truthfulness. Because if he says it's proof, what that's saying is that it actually does. So not only do you have omniscience, I didn't even think at this point. So in this first point that I make, I say it's about omniscience, but it's about something more than that. It's about veracity. Because if you're telling me that this sheet is actually proof of something, but it isn't proof, then you're not being truthful. So not only are you perhaps not, if you're omniscient and you're presenting that to me, then you're not being truthful. If you're not omniscient and you're presenting that to me, then you don't possess one of the necessary attributes that you have to have. Well, I mean, that's a bit of a tautological statement. You don't possess this necessary attribute for a God, which is the omniscient, or at least the God of the Bible. This is omniscience, right? So you can't both be omniscient and telling me the truth in that passage. That's another way of saying it. All right, let me keep moving lest I get too carried away. This is therefore a great place for exposing the text as the product of human beings and not a God, because it is within the Deuteronomic code. So let me say this again. This is therefore a great place for exposing the text as the product of human beings and not a God, right? Because it's within the Deuteronomic code. And it is difficult here to pretend that the obvious ignorance is poetic or symbolic. This is a very important point. You have you have this thing. Oh, let me finish reading that, and then we'll unpack it. It is difficult here to pretend that the obvious ignorance is poetic or symbolic. There is a legal element here which imposes a literalness on the interpretation that many apologists try to avoid in Genesis, for instance. So when you come to these Deuteronomic like strictures and laws, etc., you run into a passage that you can't stretch the tarp of poetry over this to try to cover it over and glaze it. You can't do it that way. You've got to deal with it, and it's with it. I responded to someone's comment and said this passage reveals the craters in Yahweh's face. You get to see the dark underbelly here because there's no out. You can't pull the cover of poeticism over this. Let's see. Let me make sure I pull this up so that we can continue on reading. Because the science behind the virginity sheet being a proof or evidence is demonstrably false. So this argument, I'm setting down the initial, the initial proposition is assuming that the science is demonstrably false. Now, I think I've made that argument quite clearly in in the first installment of this trilogy, where I showed from that medicine website that it's just a known fact that this is not the case, right? You can't prove a person's virginity by examining their physiology in that way. And so I start this argument off with that assumption. So I say because, so that's already saying there's already things that preceded that we've established. We've shown that this is not proof, right? Because the science behind the virginity sheet being proof or evidence is demonstrably false, the inherent misogyny is immediately exposed. Now I'm making another charge, right? I'm saying that when you come to, I think it's in Acts chapter, I believe it was 10, where Peter was in Cornelius's house and he says, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. Well, this stands in opposition to that idea because now we see there is inherent misogyny. So there seems to be, it's like I deal with the men this way and I deal with the woman this way, right? This is what I meant when I analyzed the gender inequality inherent in this pericope. If you're going to have an arbitrary virginity test, why would it target only women? So this is a question, let's take a guess. Do you think this is the emanation of the mind of a woman to target themselves and put themselves in these kind of precarious capital punishment situations on the basis of bad science? Probably not. This is probably coming from a patriarchal culture. You have to ask yourself, I always say you have to. I need to bridle that tendency and say you perhaps should ask yourself very important questions as to why this text is so inherently, why there's this inequality, for men and women in text. Where is that coming from? It probably gives you a window into who's written it, right? Now, the next argument is the bad science being tethered to capital punishment is an obvious injustice on its own terms. The fact that proof or the proof of premarital promiscuity was necessary in order to then impose the death sentence implies that the obvious justice, that is a justice which involved tethering the punishment to a deed or deeds done by the accused, was necessary. One can't simply or cannot simply retreat to God's prerogative over life, in this case, as some do with genocide and infanticide in the book of Joshua, because here there is an attempt at making it appear to be fair. Now, this is a little bit more complex and it's a little in the weeds. So let's navigate this argument I'm making. The bad science being tethered to capital punishment is an obvious injustice. Now, I'm appealing to a certain innate or intrinsic understanding of justice there, but I'm going to go a little bit further to show how even the text itself is seemingly functioning under certain rules that it's breaking. So, right? And I say it's an obvious injustice, not only to us intrinsically or innately, but it's an injustice on its own terms. Now, I try to defend that statement in the next sentence where I say the fact that the proof, which we just dealt with maybe two propositions ago, that the proof of premarital promiscuity was necessary, right? So there's the, I don't know, maybe you want to call it a kangaroo court, but there's the sense in which you're trying to give the appearance. Any of you guys have maybe seen this when you see a sort of trial. This would happen in America with lynchings, where they would supposedly be giving they would try to put on the facade of, oh, we're doing this to get to justice, but in actuality, it was just a lynching. It was a kangaroo court, right? So the fact that proof of premarital promiscuity was necessary in order to then impose the death sentence implies that the obvious, and when I say obvious, I'm referring to proof being something that you're showing people, the obvious justice, that is justice which involved tethering the punishment to a deed or deeds done by the accused, was necessary. So the whole process seems to be, at least on the surface, trying to say this is fair, right? One can't simply retreat to God's prerogative over life in this case. You see, now, because of the way it's set up, you can't just say, oh, well, he has a right to kill who he wants. Well, for one, he's not the one killing the accused. It's the men of the city who do that, right? But you don't have, you can't just say, oh, well, like they do in Joshua. Well, let me just finish reading. One can't just simply retreat. One cannot simply retreat to God's prerogative over life, in this case, as some do with genocide and infanticide in the book of Joshua. Indeed, that does happen in the book of Joshua. They'll say, well, he has a right. The Lord killeth, the Lord maketh alive, right? But here, because there's the veneer of justice in an actual trial, you're not affording yourself that tool, that apologetic tool. So that's another reason. I don't want to dwell there too long. I probably have. You can, let me see. Oh. Okay. Let me make sure. Okay. Oh yeah, I didn't pull up the passage. I'm sorry. I got to go back just a little for a second here. It says, if you're going to have an arbitrary virginity test, why would you target only women? And I meant to pull up this passage. It's a passage from Genesis 18. Let's see. It's Genesis 18. Bear with me, folks. Got a little pulling up to do here. Genesis 18:25. Hopefully you guys see. Yeah. It says, far be it. This is Abraham as he was pleading with God over rescuing his I think it was his nephew. He says, far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? So he's appealing, interestingly, he's appealing to his own attribute of justice, saying that you're this judge of all the earth. Are you? As far be it from you to not to sweep away the righteous with the wicked. And that I was contrasting with the arbitrariness of this virginity test and why it only it only targets women. The question being, again, putting the words of Abraham up here and saying, far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill a person for something unjustly, essentially. To sweep a person up and, obviously that's not exactly what Abraham was saying there, but you do get the message here. All right, let's go back to, all right, so now we got to scroll back up. All right, so I say here, you cannot retreat to the contemporaneous Canaanite cultures for cover because so much of the law was given to distinguish the Israelites from their neighbors. And I'm going to pull up a passage to prove that. Right? We got Deuteronomy 18:9. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. Because of these same detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. So here, again, you can see he's saying, for all those who would just claim that what is going on here is perhaps just God acquiescing to contemporaneous Canaanite culture, you can see that right there in Deuteronomy, he's making it clear, look, I'm trying to actually separate you. You're not to take up the practice. So I guess if one wants me to say this more concisely, I would say he's clearly able to part ways with contemporaneous Canaanite culture when he wants to make a point. So the question then becomes, why not in this case? Why would he, especially given the dubious science behind a virginity proof? See what I'm saying? I'm going to move on. Even the dietary restrictions are said to be intended to set a difference between them and the surrounding nations. I'm going to pull up another passage. This is not, keep all my decrees. This is, I think I just read 23. You must not live according to the customs of the nation. So this is Leviticus 20:23. He says, you must not live according to the customs of the nations I am going to drive out before you, because they did all these things. I abhorred them, right? But I said to you, you will possess their land. I will give it to you as an inheritance, a land flowing with milk and honey, et cetera, et cetera. No, let me read on. I am the Lord your God who has set you apart from the nations. So again, I'm just using that to say he's clearly able to part ways with contemporaneous culture, right? Let's go on. Okay. I think we're almost done, right? If you try to retreat to the surrounding cultures of the time, you do violence to Isaiah 55:8. Let's see what that says. Isaiah 55:8 says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. So basically, I'm making the case he has the ability on numerous occasions to say, we're parting ways with the culture that surrounds you. The question is, why would he keep the ways of the culture around them in a situation where the science is this bad? That's the question you have to answer. Or that's the question you should try to answer. That's what I'm presenting you with. This is, I guess, the last statement I have to make before getting out of here for the day. The notion of justice here is conceptual enough to render the costume of condescension a few sizes too small and making the apologetic salve of words like anthropomorphic or anthropopathic ineffective. I'm going to say that again. I don't want to get, well, I'll say it and then I'll explain some things here. The notion of justice here is conceptual enough to render the costume of condescension a few sizes too small. And so when I say to render the costume of condescension, that's me sort of almost poetically referring to when people say in the text, oh, he's doing certain things to condescend or to accommodate. And one of the ways they speak of it, or two of the ways I name later, they'll say he uses anthropomorphic or anthropopathic language. Anthropopathic having to do with our like almost like emotional language, and anthropomorphic is when they use terminology like the hand of God or the under his wings, that kind of thing. They're using things that are symbolic of particular features within the divine being, but that don't reflect an actual description. So it's not meant to be literally descriptive. It's meant to just to provide you with somewhat of almost like an illustration to accompany. It's condescension. It's the language of condescension is the best way to put it. So I'll read that again. The notion of justice here is conceptual enough to render the costume of condescension a few sizes too small and making the apologetic salve of words like anthropomorphic or anthropopathic ineffective. So you can't, this is such a conceptual thing. This is just justice. We're talking about basically a court of law. You can't get away with the precision required in them saying you're going to produce proof. It doesn't allow for you, oh, he's condescending. You can't. So, all of the condescension language that they try to use in Genesis and stuff to try to get around the fact that it's not accurate in its description of things, you can't do that here. And that brings me back to the top before we end this episode. This is why this passage, that is Deuteronomy 22, 20, I think it's let me see, I think it's 18 or something through 21 or something like that. This is why this passage is so uniquely suited for it. I usually just say Deuteronomy 22:20, because that particular passage where she's being put to death for the on bad science is just so egregious. But here, these are the reasons. So let's recap and then we'll keep it moving. This is about God's omniscience. And I pointed out how, I pointed out not only his omniscience, but his truthfulness. I noted that just extemporaneously, that it also has to do with his truthfulness, because when you present something as proof that's not proof, then now you're not being true. So this veracity is on trial here too, right? But so in this first point, it's about God's omniscience and his veracity. If he knows all, he shouldn't be giving laws which reflect the ignorance of mankind at the time. 2, this is therefore a great place for exposing the text as the product of human beings and not a God, because it is within the Deuteronomic code. It is difficult here to pretend that the obvious ignorance is poetic or symbolic. There is a legal element here which imposes a literalness on the interpretation that many apologists try to avoid in Genesis, for instance. Moving on. Because the science behind the virginity sheet, being a proof or evidence, is demonstrably false, the inherent misogyny is immediately exposed. This is what I meant when I analyzed the gender inequality inherent in this pericope. If you are going to have an arbitrary virginity test, why would it target only women? All right, moving on. The bad science being tethered to capital punishment is an obvious injustice on its own terms. The fact that proof of premarital promiscuity was necessary in order to then impose the death sentence implies that the obvious justice, that is, a justice which involved tethering the punishment to a deed or deeds done by the accused, was necessary. One cannot simply retreat to God's prerogative over life in this case, as some do with genocide and infanticide in the book of Joshua, because here there is an attempt to make it appear to be fair. Moving on. You cannot retreat to the contemporaneous Canaanite cultures for cover because so much of the law was given to distinguish the Israelites from their neighbors. Even the dietary restrictions are said to be intended to set a difference between them and the surrounding nations. And if you try to retreat to the surrounding cultures of the time, you do violence to passages which speak about God's thoughts being higher than ours, and like Isaiah 55:8. The notion of justice here is conceptual enough to render the costume of condescension a few sizes too small and making the apologetic salve of words like anthropomorphic or anthropopathic ineffective. All right. Having said all of those things, having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, let us purify ourselves of this nonsense and finally put an end to this barbaric teaching and all of its the apologists who not only do these things, but they approve of them who practice them. All right, have a good week, folks.